I'm Tom Gillesberg, running as an independent candidate for the general parliamentary election here in Denmark, here in Copenhagen, with this, I think by now, very famous poster, win-win with BRICS, not collapse and war. And it's definitely the case that the campaign I have been running and the interviews I have been giving also to the Danish media is totally different from what otherwise has been going on in the election, where it has been like most elections, blue team contra red team discussing who's going to give a little bit of more of this, a little bit, are we going to spend a little bit more on the hospitals, a little bit more on the unemployed, are we going to make it a little bit tougher for some of the people? But whereas economists has been saying this is all something out in the third decimal point of something. I mean, it's not really important whether one side or the other win. The policy will remain the same. And the reason I'm running is exactly to change that, because both sides are basically saying we are going to continue the present policy, and as I see it and many other international observers, then this present policy Denmark is part of is very problematic. That right now, first of all, it's in the process of leading to a financial collapse, not coming from Denmark as such, but coming from the fact that since 2007-2008, nothing was done to improve the transatlantic financial system. It's just as broken as before. It's even more broken because there's much more financial speculation now than there was in 2007-2008. All of the money that has been put into circulation by quantitative easing has all gone to speculation, none to real physical investments. At the same time, we see an increasing tension, confrontation policy, you could say, which also was borne out at the G7 summit taking place in Bavaria yesterday, by saying Russia and also China and what we now know as the BRICS countries has to play by our rules. They have to do as we tell them. And when we, as has come out in Germany, where you've had the former chancellors like Helmut Schmidt, like Gerhard Schröder, and now even the present foreign minister of Germany, Steinmeier, has come out and said this is the wrong policy. Russia should have been invited to the G7 summit. We need to include Russia if we are to solve the world's problems. But right now, the policy that was adopted also with Merkel together with the rest of the G7 is no, we're going to have confrontation with Russia. And this is a confrontation which by the dynamic of the situation in Ukraine, if that is pursued, if there's Western military support to Ukraine out of this, this will very easily turn into a direct confrontation between the West, United States in Ukraine, and Russia on the other side. And we see the same kind of confrontation policy going on in the South China Sea, that the BRICS countries, which have come out and said, yes, we represent something different. They had the big summit in Fortaleza in Brazil last year, where they presented a new development bank. They presented a currency reserve arrangement where they could defend their currencies if they come under attack. China has been the driving force in creating the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which 57 countries actually joined in. They have a new Silk Road Fund, a maritime Silk Road Fund. They are putting out enormous amounts of credits directly from the Chinese state to South America, to African countries, and trying to do the same in Europe as a way of transforming the global economic system from one where financial speculation and bankers' arithmetic rules to being one of infrastructure development, economic development. And this is what they explicitly, Xi Jinping has called a win-win policy. And it's a policy which the BRICS countries stand united behind, which not only is the two most populous countries in the world, China and India, another major strategic power and the biggest territory in the world, Russia, but this is also Brazil, and thereby including all of South America, and it's also South Africa, which sees itself as a representative for all of Africa in this collaboration. So what I have been trying to raise in the election campaign, and partly been successful in doing in some of the interviews I've been giving, is to present the fact that this is what's going to decide the Danish future, this is going to decide the European future, this is what is going to decide the future of the world. That we, right now, on the one side, stand with a tremendous potential through this win-win policy. If the United States and Europe joins hands with the BRICS and collaborates on this, this will be the biggest renaissance the world has ever seen. This will not be a little renaissance in one country. This will be the whole world suddenly collaborating in transforming the world economy and the circumstances for the world population to a much, much better situation. But if we do not have this collaboration, if instead the United States and Europe does what was going on at the G7 summit, say, no, we want confrontation of war, then we might very soon have a strategic crisis. We might, either by intention or mistake, actually going into thermonuclear war. And this is something that people have to be aware of. This is something that, whether it's governments, whether it's military personnel, they have to address. And that situation has to be brought under control by responsible circles in the United States and Europe, saying, now we take that off the agenda. We might not agree on everything, like the BRICS countries don't agree on everything, but we can agree on one thing, and that is we need collaboration to solve the world's problem, and we need to join this win-win perspective.
I'm just curious to know if when you speak to an average voter, do you speak the same language? Is a Danish now, today interested by this issue in an election time?
It's, I will say, I mean, when I've been out on the streets, I've actually had people coming up to me saying, I'm a conditor, I've seen your posters, and please tell me, what is this BRICS? Because I remember last time there was elections, you had this other poster on Glass-Steagall or Chaos, and I didn't understand it. But then I read something about it, and I found out that this was actually very important issues. So I don't know what BRICS is. Please tell me, what is it? Why is this so important? So I will say that especially among young people, there are a certain awareness of BRICS, young students and others, because this is being talked about in those institutions. In general, I will say the problem is that most people haven't really heard much about BRICS. The normal coverage in the Danish media on the BRICS has been financial coverage. It's been the Goldman Sachs definition of BRICS as being emerging markets, investment opportunities, chance of earning quick money, which was how the terminology of BRICS was born. But since that time, BRICS has actually come together and become something totally different. Not an investment terminology, but a real physical, intensive collaboration between these countries. And this most people don't know. I mean, that's why, one of the reasons why I chose to run this election campaign this way. I mean, it's not the easiest way to gather votes, because a lot of people don't know about this. But it is a way of educating people on the real issues of today. And there are certain pockets out there of people who, I got one mail where it says, finally somebody is addressing the question of the danger of war. Because nobody, I mean, everybody is just discussing small, fairly irrelevant issues for how the future will look. So it's I mean, I will say what I consider the biggest fight in this whole thing is that Europe right now, Denmark and the rest of the European Union in general, is caught up in a paradigm, a very dysfunctional paradigm, where there's this idea, once we were industrial powers, then we had a transition over to the post-industrial society, where we don't have to produce anymore, where other people will do that for us, where we are all consumers. And then came in this whole green agenda with climate policies. The big question is, can we reduce our carbon dioxide emissions? And this is not reality. The big question right now is not if we can limit our emission of CO2. The big question right now is if we can prevent this confrontation policy, if we can prevent getting thermonuclear war, and if we can prevent the present economic collapse from leading into a new dark age, and instead having a transition to a totally different policy where we will have a future. So I will say it's not easy.
I know, but I've been to a country, a member of BRICS. People there don't understand what BRICS about and don't expect much, honestly. So I'm just curious to know what a day in Copenhagen or in Odense will be really interested in this. It's up to now, it's just an empty shell. It's
yes.
Nothing.
And I will also say this is to a large degree also the fault of the government, because Denmark has actually had over the last 10 years a policy of joining, of collaborating very much more closely with China. There has been an understanding that China represents the future, that we have to piggyback on China somehow. We have to hold on to China, be close, have a strategic partnership with China. That will be very important for the Danish future, not just for projects in China and in Denmark, but also collaborating with China many other places in the world. That could be in Africa, where China then will contribute what they're good at in terms of infrastructure, other things, but where there might be other things that Denmark has much more expertise in, which is also needed. This understanding is in the Danish Foreign Ministry. The present government, almost all of the ministers have been on visit to China. The Prime Minister has been there twice within the last 4 years. The Danish Queen has been on a state visit to China. So I think the fact that Denmark joined the AIIB was a reflection of that. That there was, when suddenly word came out that despite Obama saying European countries should not join, Britain, France, Germany and Italy said we're going to join. Immediately certain circles in Denmark says, and me too, we have to join. We have to get in as one of the founding members, because this is going to be extremely important for Asia, but this is also going to be extremely important for everybody else joining. So Denmark, I think at the same time as we're in a very close strategic partnership with the United States and with Britain, and have been one of the coalition of the willing in terms of going to war around the world. At the same time, there's also a policy in Denmark that we should economically really collaborate with China and with India and with these other countries. We have to be there. The point is, you can't have both. That what Denmark faces right now is the same as what the United States faces, as the rest of Europe faces, is we can't both have close collaboration, strategic collaboration with these countries and go to war with these countries. So we come to the point where a choice has to be made, where this war policy has to be taken off the table and where the strategic collaboration has to be enhanced. And this is the real issues. In the Danish Foreign Ministry, there's an understanding of these issues. In the Danish government, there's also somewhat of an understanding of this. That's why we joined the AIIB. The problem is the job of educating the population on these issues had not been done. And the present election campaign would be such an opportunity also to do such things. It has not been done. So that has to be rectified. That has to be changed. Journalists and media has a big job in terms of getting this reality out. And I'm trying to do what I can with this, but it's a big problem. And as you say, even in the countries of the BRICS, the BRICS policy is not something that comes from underneath. This is not a popular policy which then rises up and become government policy. This is policy leadership from above, especially these BRICS summit. There's been a very close, very high-level collaboration between Putin, now Xi Jinping, Modi from India. After Modi came into government, this has changed India's role in this. But the same with South Africa and Brazil. These leaders sitting together and discussing have a dynamic where they really rise to the occasion, where when they're together, they become much more than they were apart. They think bigger. And then they all also face this challenge. How do you then take this policy and, so to speak, move the country along with it? Which is, one thing is sitting in Denmark. If a government here decides, now we move, I would say it's a lot easier than when Modi sits in India and try to get the whole Indian nation to move along. Or some of the other countries. And this is really a very, very intense fight. I mean, for instance, Brazil was Dilma Rousseff just won the presidential election in Brazil, but she's been under heavy attack. There's been attempts to make a colored revolution in Brazil. The financial market says this new development fund will never be accepted in Brazil. We will stop it. And what happened was that the Chinese foreign minister came to Brazil in the midst of big crisis in Petrobras, the oil company there, corruption scandals, and where everything is coming to a halt because Petrobras has no more money, the gas and oil prices are low. And the Chinese foreign minister came in and made agreements where China will invest $53 billion in Brazilian infrastructure projects. All of the money they didn't have, suddenly they have. The economy can move forward. You won't have mass unemployment. And at the same time, they then put in $20 billion for a development fund. So it's a fight. And this is a fight where, as I see it here from Denmark, you can say, what would it matter if one country, for instance Denmark, would come out openly saying we should go with this policy with BRICS and we won't have any more wars. Well, I tell you, if Denmark did that, then that would tilt the whole balance in Europe. Because Denmark being such a close ally of the United States, that would immediately mean that other countries, like Germany, like France, that really are so dissatisfied with this confrontation policy with Russia, and are hurting economically because of the laws of export, because of this embargo policy with Russia. Then if Denmark would come out with that, they would immediately come along. There would be then there would be in Germany a popular revolt, and it's almost there already. So this idea that one person or one country can't really make a difference, I think that's totally wrong. I think definitely one country can make a huge difference. And I think also that individual persons can make a difference by simply changing the whole discussion. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Just one last question.
Yes.
You are talking about a win-win situation here.
Yes.
Let's just come to a real issue. One of the major issues here is under debate is immigration. Do you see a prospect, if you are elected and pushing for this win-win partnership with Denmark, would you support like Indians, Brazilian workers coming to India, to Denmark work, as you can see Danish companies going to India or China having opportunities? Would you support that? What's your views on immigration, let's say?
Well, the point is, I mean, Modi has been... Yes, no, I'm speaking... We have a problem in Denmark, like in most most Western European countries, or like Japan. We are not getting enough babies. Mm-hmm. If we don't import people, societies is going to come to a halt. So the question is not, should there be more foreigners coming to Denmark? Of course there should be. But we have to make sure they come here and have real work for a good salary. That's the point. That's the fight. We don't want social dumping. We don't want we don't want to have a lot of people coming here, going around on the streets with nothing to do and, trying to find a job for $1 or $2 or whatever. So that is going to be solved by two different processes taking place at the same time. On the one side, all of these people right now, this wave of immigrants coming to Europe right now, where do they come from? They come from right now through Northern Africa, through Libya. Why through Libya? Because Denmark, together with a lot of other countries, had six months of heavy bombardment of Libya and destroyed the Libyan army and destroyed the Libyan state. And now it's a dysfunctional state, and therefore you have this chaos that's coming out. We see the same in other parts of Northern Africa, potentially in big parts of the Middle East if we don't change the process. These people, like people coming from Syria, these people that are coming from Syria right now would never go to Denmark if it was not for the fact that the Western policy of going against Assad and having regime change led to a total collapse of the Syrian state. And people, after having lived through that for many, many years, come to the conclusion we will never have a future anymore in Syria, we have to leave. So it's very simple. We have, with this win-win policy, we can actually go in and make it possible for people that live in nations right now and haven't had much hope for the future, to have hope for the future, because there's a development in their country, there's economic development, infrastructure development. People then will prefer to stay at home and have a good job and provide for their family than going into a very distant place like Denmark. But we, as I said, so it's two things. We have to, instead of creating chaos and war around the world, we have to go in and create development. Then we won't have Islamic State or ISIS or these groups, because people will have better things to do. When that is said, at the same time, we will see a pattern where the world will be much more interwoven, where we will have people coming to Denmark, not because they're forced to come to Denmark because there was no future at home, but because we need their skills. We need them here to work. Like is already the case. I mean, there's been a lot of import of labor force to Denmark, because else we wouldn't be able to staff the hospitals. And I think this tension we have right now is brought about by a wrong economic policy. An economic policy where you see human beings as a problem instead of as a resource. If you make the proper investments as a government, then you create new workplaces. You create a field where you have a constant lack of labor force and you need more and more people to come in and fill the holes, and the whole economy is growing faster and faster and faster, and the living standard keeps increasing. That's the kind of policy we had in Europe in the post-World War II period. Like in Germany, for instance, they had a policy that anybody that wants to come to Germany can come to Germany. And a big part of the German economic miracle was that you had foreigners coming to Germany and becoming skilled labor and working in German industry. It was not a problem. It was a benefit. So that's a question of what policy do you have. Do you have an economic policy where human beings are treated as something positive, as something resourceful, something you use, you put them to productive work, and thereby creating wealth, instead of just seeing as somebody who is another mouth to feed. That's this policy. I mean, I think this you really have to understand also with this win-win policy in this sense. This is not an Asian geopolitical bloc against the European, the transatlantic geopolitical bloc. This is a different paradigm. It's a different policy. It's going back to what we used to believe in Europe, that human beings are actually something valuable, something good. This is a big fight like in India for Modi, of getting people to see it that way, because there's so many poor people. But they're conscious about it, they're fighting about it. The thing is, here in Denmark, all of this is really so much easier for us to understand if we just would discuss it. I think most Danes have no problem in seeing Denmark going out and help building up the world. They're happy for it. They're proud of Denmark building bridges about the world. They're proud if we can contribute. And foreigners coming to Denmark, in general, Danes like foreigners. They like to talk with people from different cultures, as long as they don't feel threatened in their livelihood. If they feel, if you can create a discussion where you say it's either these foreigners coming in and getting money or you getting your health care, then people freak out. And that's this fake discussion that has been created. So,
you're still one of the election's most sure losers.
Well, I would put it this way. If you run a hell of an election campaign and you get to be Prime Minister of Denmark, and we get thermonuclear war and mankind is wiped out, that's not much of a win. Or if we right now, you win the election but have no policy for what to deal with the financial collapse, Greece defaults on their debts to the IMF, you get a domino effect of all of the banks collapsing, that's not much of a win either. I mean, the problem we have with the election campaign and why the journalists can even say such a thing is from the standpoint of an election campaign being like a sport contest. You have blue team, you have red team, who's going to win? The difference is, in a certain sense, that if somebody who wins this sports game, after it finished, you can go home and it didn't really matter. You could be all roused up, but then afterwards you can go home and it didn't really matter. These questions of war and peace either direct through military confrontations or through lack of economic development. These are questions of life and death. And if we don't get it right, then we can't go home happily afterwards and say, well, it was just a sports game. Then it's the future we have lost. And of course, it's more difficult in Denmark. If you were sitting in Spain or in Portugal, you feel this, or in Greece or in Ireland. People feel this on their body, that life is, their future, their perspective is gone. Here, luckily, we have a situation where the economy is in much better shape, where we are very privileged by having a very differentiated economy. So it's more difficult for people to get this sense of urgency about this. I would rather have that situation. I would rather have that we have a better situation in Denmark, and it's more difficult for me to get the people in the discussion than we had terrible circumstances and it would be easier. Because the point is, for me, this does not end on election day. Then everybody packs down, everybody goes home. Now we don't have to discuss these issues for another 2 or 4 years. This discussion will intensify after the 18th. And hopefully, then a lot of the other political forces which did not want to discuss these things because they think it's bad for their election campaign. It's much easier to take the small issues. Come June 18th, then they have to, the new government will then have to face these issues. And then I hope through what I've been putting on the agenda during the election campaign will actually enhance the discussion. And I think it will. I tell you, there's nobody in Danish political life which do not think about this issue when they see my poster. It's forced upon them. And whether they like it or not, this is reality, and this reality is much more present. And that opens up a field of discussion which might not be so open in the election campaign because of the sports games dynamic, but it will be there also after the election.
This is Michelle Rasmussen, Executive Intelligence Review, Washington. What is your vision of the future? Because in your campaign literature, you have spoken about that we have to come away from speculation and the casino economy and get back into a world based on scientific and technological progress. So what is your vision, and how is that going to affect the economy and the society?
I think if we can make it through the next 18 months, if we can make sure that we do not get this confrontation and we do not get thermonuclear war by mistake or by intent, and we can make sure that these attempts to collapse the BRICS, destabilize the different countries don't work, and I don't think they will work, then I'm extremely optimistic, because already by now we have seen that China has basically begun to take over where the United States left off in all different fields. It's not just production. It's not just high-speed trains. China right now has the most ambitious fusion power program. They have a very ambitious space program. All of these projects that used to be American, like putting a man on the moon, China has now begun and continued all of these projects. Now it's the Chinese that's going to put the next man on the moon. But they're not just going to put a man on the moon. They already now have a program to go to the moon, do mining on the moon, to mine helium-3, transport it back to Earth and use it for fusion power here. They educate like crazy in all of the scientific fields. They have a very explicit idea, like Xi Jinping has been totally explicit on this. It used to be made in China. In the future, it should be created in China. Now, if you have a driver like that, like we had with Kennedy and the United States and going to the moon, this program, this impacted the whole world. And this will, if we have a collaboration from Europe and the United States with China, with the BRICS, this will mean very quickly that Europe, that the United States will go into a positive competition in all of these fields. That in order for us, part of this collaboration will be that we also have to begin doing all of these things again. Because if we don't, then we are left behind. And nobody wants to be left behind. So suddenly you will have a situation where all of the BRICS countries right now, they're space powers. They're going, India, they actually had a mission to Mars. Brazil, South Africa, they're going into space, and this is becoming an increasing collaboration. Nuclear power, all of these countries right now, together with a lot of other countries with them, is heavily going into nuclear power. At the same time as Europe and the United States have not built any nuclear power for a long time, these countries go big time for nuclear power because they need it for their development. At the same time, China is very explicitly saying, but we don't want to stop there, we want to have fusion power. That's what's going to be defining mankind's future. So what we are seeing right now, the potential of this is a transformation of planet Earth. This is of the noosphere really expanding, of human intellectual life going into a totally new phase and going to be backed up with a lot of physical things, physical infrastructure. But this physical infrastructure, like the old Silk Route, we have made, the international campaign I'm part of has made this very fascinating report. The new Silk Road becomes the world's land bridge, where you have this old Silk Road with the camels, but you also have the new Silk Road with the maglev with going to the moon. The old Silk Road was not just economic advantageous things. It was not just transporting silk from China or paper or this or that. The most important effect of the Silk Route at that time was intellectual exchange. It was to get not just goods, but getting human ideas which had been created in one part of the planet, get it to other parts of the planet. And the same thing we will see with this new world order that is right now coming up. I mean, there's a lot of physical transformations, but the most important thing will be that we suddenly will have a lot of countries in the world rivaling in coming up with new scientific ideas, new cultural breakthroughs, new beautiful human creations, which they then, to a much larger degree than earlier, will share. I mean, one effect of having this war policy, this confrontation policy, is exactly to destroy that, to destroy exchange of ideas, to destroy exchange of human beings going back and forth. Can we put that confrontation policy aside? Then we will have a much, much more rich exchange. And if you look at history, where did you have the most development? Was that in places where you had a very cultural, ethnical, clean population, which did not interact with anybody else? Is that where you had the big scientific breakthroughs? No. It was always in the melting pot. It was always at the crossroads, when you had different cultures meet, not in a clash of civilization, but in a collaboration of civilizations. And suddenly, at those points, that's where you suddenly had big riches in terms of intellectual development, but also then economically, physically. That's where things were happening. And that's the nations which then, and cultures which kept living, whereas those that isolated themselves, they died out. Probably simply by boredom, you know. And that's, I think, I mean, this thing about the immigration question has been used in Denmark in the most ugly way in the last decades, politically, to set a political agenda where you simply pop that and then you don't discuss much more pressing issues. It's also, as I said, this is totally anti-Danish in reality, because Danes, if anybody, all Danes, almost all Danes, they actually travel to the rest of the world. They do not have an ambition of sitting the same place in Denmark and see nothing of the world. They want to go out, they want to see the world. Young Danish farmers, they go to Australia, they go to the United States, they go out in the big world to see something new, to be inspired. And then at some point, then they come back home and they might have their work here, but they also like to go out sometimes to the rest of the world and maybe also a little bit warmer places. So that's what Denmark is. And this artificial, this that we don't like foreigners, this is totally artificial. And I think with this policy, we can do away with that. And we can do what we like to do. I mean, which is, always was the case. I mean, for instance, the black civil rights movement in the United States, you had all of those issues. Well, one of the places where Marian Anderson, great singers, great black artists, where would they go? They would go to Denmark. They would go to Scandinavia. Why? Because here they were treated as human beings. Here they were treated as artists, not as somebody defined by their color. And I think that's what Denmark is. That's what the Danish culture is. And we have to get back to that. I mean, who wants to sit? You want to have a group where everybody can sit and they look the same and they eat the same and they think the same. It's a very boring life.
You started out your press conference was speaking about the BRICS development perspective, but there's a history to this. I know that you are also the chairman of the Schiller Institute in Denmark, and there's a past history. What is the role of the Schiller Institute and Lyndon LaRouche's political movement in both calling for new just world economic order and also a new Silk Road policy?
Well, that's a very long history, going back before the foundation of the Schiller Institute in '84, going back also to Lyndon LaRouche back in 1975, calling for establishment of an international development bank, saying that there has to be new institutions which will give credit for this economic development which can transform the nations of the world. And this, from the beginning, Helga Sepp LaRouche, the wife of Lyndon LaRouche, this was one of the intentions with her founding the Schiller Institute, was to keep a collaboration between the United States and Europe at a time when that was very much in doubt in the 80s, beginning of the 80s, but at the same time having very explicitly the idea of a new just world economic order. And the Schiller Institute, through many, many conferences, were developing this. As we had the whole development coming in the fall of the Berlin Wall, later the collapse of the Soviet Union, we came out with a lot of conferences and saying, this is the big opportunity. We should now have collaboration. We should build infrastructure going east-west, which we didn't have before. We should use our economic capacity to develop the Eastern European economies, going into collaboration with Russia, etc., etc. And as that did not pick up, because the Western European governments chose not to go for development, but go more for this unipolar world, you could say, of expanding NATO and the European Union, Helga Sepp LaRouche became the Silk Road lady in China, going around saying, we need the new Silk Road. We need to have Asia and Europe connected with infrastructure corridors. And that whole fight, that is actually what we now see the BRICS have become. That the BRICS term BRICS originated with Goldman Sachs as an investment term, as some question of where can you go and make quick money on speculation. But the irony is that the BRICS countries has adopted this policy we have been fighting for the last 4 decades. And that has now become the center of the BRICS policy, including very explicitly with the creation of a new development bank, with China creating all of these development funds, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And so this is the policy that we have been fighting for. And this is a policy that is now becoming the reality of the world. And it's this reality we now have to make sure that we can get Europe and the United States to, instead of fighting it, to embrace it and to join it. And I think this will happen. This will not happen in 10 years or in 20 years. Already this year we'll see dramatic changes in the world where we are faced with this choice that, like with the BRICS countries, the first American colonies had this slogan: either we hang together or we get hanged separately. This is the strong glue of the whole BRICS dynamic. People say, how they're so different, it will fall apart. No, because they know if they don't work together, if they don't stay together, then they don't stand a chance on their own. But that's also the case for the rest of the world right now. We are in a situation where this win-win policy is the only policy right now which will bring survival. Everything else, this confrontation policy, can only lead to, one way or another, to the extinction of mankind. So I think it's a very pregnant moment in history right now. I think that what I hope will happen, whether or not I get elected to parliament, what I hope will happen is that a lot of other people here in Denmark and other parts of the world will begin to stand up on 2 feet and say, we want to discuss this reality, we have to join this reality. We don't want to sit passive back and let this opportunity be lost. Whether they sit in ministries, whether they're in the military, whatever they're doing out there in the big world, many more people have to begin not just to vote for people like me, but much more importantly, become active and take responsibility for this transformation.
I have one last question. A lot of the press coverage that you have gotten in this election and in the last election was based on the fact that you had forecast the financial crash of 2007, 2008 in your election campaign at the beginning of 2007. So how did you know this? What economic principles do you base this on? And what, in your literature, you talk about a 3-point economic recovery program. What is this about?
Well, to be honest, I knew it because I'm a close collaborator of Lyndon LaRouche. And I'm part of an international organization which daily follows what's going on in the world, which makes strategic analysis, and thereby could forecast very simply that the world financial system had been taken over by a cancer of financial speculation, that money no more went into real physical production, and you had created huge bubbles which just were waiting to pop. Like we have, I will say, today. Therefore, we said, how do we deal with this? And this is, as you say, today, well, what's the concrete thing we also, besides this win-win collaboration with BRICS, what should Denmark do? What should other countries do when faced with a popping of a financial bubble and a collapsing financial system? Point number 1, Glass-Steagall banking separation. You have to differentiate between normal banking activities, normal lending to private persons, to companies, and financial speculation. And what Roosevelt did in 1933 in the United States was he by law said those two things has to be separate. Normal commercial banks are no longer allowed to do financial speculation. Banks doing financial speculation should not be allowed to have normal banking activities. And they will not be supported by the government. They will not be saved by the government. That worked up until it was Glass-Steagall was repealed in 1999 in the United States. That has to be created in Denmark, in all other countries. You have to have this separation back. Once you've done that, and you clean up, that a lot of financial values will disappear. And you just have to make sure they disappear in a way where you still have functioning banks, you still have a functioning economy. Then you have to create new credit. How do you do that? That's the job of the state. If the private interests won't do it, and they probably won't because they're all bankrupt, then let the state do it. And Denmark is already taking part of it. The AIIB, what's that? Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. That is that states go in and put money in a bank with the explicit purpose of funding infrastructure development. That's what we have to do. Then sit down in Denmark, other places, and say, what big infrastructure projects do we have which will increase the productivity, the wealth creation in the Danish economy, like a bridge over Kattegat, like a Danish maglev system, like Femern Belt could be pushed forward, done quickly. Investments in other types of investments that you can make, that can develop the economy, including in science, including in space. And this, you simply let the state, to the degree it's necessary, go in and make that type of investments. And then suddenly you have, like we see it, we haven't seen it here in a while, but you've seen it in China, then in very short time you can take even very dismal conditions and transform it into a prospering economy. This is not something pie in the sky out in the future. Right now, Denmark is not, we're not the worst hit, but we have a situation in Greece right now coming to the point where Greece cannot survive with austerity policy. They need a change in policy. They need debt relief. They need investments. They need to get the economy moving. Right now, the European countries are saying, we will not allow that. Then Greece will be saying, then we leave your system. Then we go with the BRICS. That by itself could already this month collapse the transatlantic financial system, because it's not, even though a lot of the debt to Greece sits in European banks, we have this wonderful thing called derivatives, ironically taken, where you have a global financial system where all of the banks have all of these derivatives contracts with banks in the United States, other parts of the world. So once, if Greece is allowed to go bankrupt, it's estimated that immediately you will have losses in the amount of at least 1,000 billion euros. A huge amount of values will go up in smoke. And therefore, we already now, we should not wait for this to happen. We should say, we know this is the danger. Let's do these things. Let's make reorganization of the financial system. Let's make new credit. Let's do these things. And the wonderful thing is, we don't have to start from scratch. The major part of the world is already moving in this direction. So it's simply a question of taking the hand that is already stretched out from Xi Jinping, from the BRICS countries, and says, yes, now let's collaborate. Let's build this.
Since you are good at predictions, besides predicting your seat in Parliament, who do you see winning the next election, the blue or the...
As it stands right now, the red team is clearly leading by points. They have the momentum. They have had a more well-coordinated strategy, you could say. The blue team created a big problem for themselves when the dumping of Lars Løkke Rasmussen was prevented by Lars Løkke Rasmussen. I mean, Venstre knew that he was a problem. he would be a liability. He did not have much respectability in the Danish population because of previous scandals. Therefore, there was an attempt to depose the king, get somebody else in there, which were not a liability. And then Venstre and the blue team would have won by a landslide. Because of Lars Løkke Rasmussen defeating that challenge, he was left as a leader, and that gave the red team what they needed, the big issue, namely that we have a prime minister that functions, that's capable of going around in the international places and function. You have Lars Løkke Rasmussen, which is catastrophe on a catastrophe. You put him to lead an international meeting, he doesn't know how to do it, he will fumble it. And that, as it stands right now, that fatal decision, that lack of change of leadership in Venstre, handed an opportunity for the present government to regain, to win the election again, and as out of the blue, pull a rabbit up of the hat and regain the election. Will Venstre will the blue team be able to regroup and do this? I mean, if I was a bookmaker right now, I would put my money on red team for this reason, because but you never know.
What about the Danish People's Party? Do you see a rise in, because that's what also the polls are predicting more?
They are. I mean, you see that all of the not old parties is right now gaining. Not because people like them especially, but because it's in disgust, you could say. I mean, that's a trend
in Europe.
Yes, and it has to do with the fact that the governments don't represent the populations, but represent the system. So the people don't feel represented. And I mean, again, and so it's a race to the bottom. Who is most despised? Because it's not like the social democracy has not done thing which has earned them a lot of disrespect from the people. They feel betrayed by them also. So that's, and as you say, this is not especially a Danish phenomenon. At the moment, when somebody in these parties decides that now I really want to represent the people, not just as a gimmick, I really want to do these things, that party and that person will have a tremendous support. And it's a big, again, Helle Thorning-Schmidt right now stands with the opportunity of winning the election. And this will already be quite something. Everybody will say this is the biggest upset in Danish election history. She has now been prime minister for 4 years, and she, I'm sure, was already making her plans of where to go next after she had lost the election. Now that would give her a new opportunity. That would be whatever she had done before, to a certain degree, is forgotten. It's a clean slate. She now has to decide what kind of prime minister would I then become. She will have the opportunity of saying, now I'm going to become a big Danish prime minister. I'm going to go with this BRICS geometry. I'm going to give real leadership to this. And that could work. And then who knows how long she can then be sitting there. Because if again, I mean, luckily it's the case that in human history it has been shown out that most of the time human beings behave very foolishly. But if you just have a few human beings doing something very smart now and then humanity can progress. So as I see it, it's a very interesting thing. You can have the present government continue, and they then have really free hands to grow. They can set a totally new agenda. And you'll have, I think you already right now see the perspective then of Venstre basically lying in ruins. And they have to be rebuilt, and it's going to take some time. So it's, I think that's good, because I don't think what they have been delivering has been that great. I think it's time there has to be a lot of change. And I'm, you know, if they call me and say, do you have some good ideas of how to rebuild Venstre, I'll be happy to share with them.
Good luck.
Thank you.
All the best.